So often when we think about how do countries grow and what is development. And in that context, it's very important to understand, first of all, what the development consists of, how to make countries move from lower to higher productivity levels, and also at the same time to think about what does law have to do with that process. Right? So what does law have to do with socioeconomic transformation? So development, which is, as I mentioned to you, one way of understanding it is that it's a social and economic transformation. Is very contested and disrupts as well as fixes things. And so it is very useful to understand what relationship we as lawyers have to that process. Rather than understand its inner dynamics and the ways it creates problems, but also it creates solutions. And to be aware of them, and particularly the more aware we are of the consequences and the blind spot tensions, the better off we are at coming up with solutions which actually make sense and help rather than create more problems. Absolutely. A rule of law is very important for any stage of development. The question there is, how do you understand the rule of law? So what does rule of law consist of? What does it mean? Right? So is it about how it structures rights and obligations that citizens have with one another, or that the state has with its citizens, or the way how the state actually functions internally, right? So these are always different ways of thinking about or conceptualizing rule of law. First of all, we need to understand what the rule of law is about, right? So unpacking that concept, and this is where the difficulty lies, because it's not an easy concept to unpack. And then it consists of many layers and many elements. But it's very important to address it. Rule of law is about what? It's about relations that individuals have with one another. It's about relations that the state has with its own apparatus. And of course, it's also about relations that the state has with citizens. And in that context, it's a web of relationships that one has to understand in order to structure them. And by doing that, one way or another, you affect development. One cannot simply put in an equation rule of law on the one hand and then economic growth on the other hand. Or, if I'm to rephrase it, one cannot simply look at the rule of law or the economic development as a consequence or result of rule of law reforms. So the cause and effect relationship here is a bit more blurry. But of course, there's some relationship between the two, because again, when we think about socioeconomic transformation, it's about how relationships between people change, how the relationship between people and society changes as a result, but also how the relationship between people and the state is affected as well. And in that sense, these three elements that I mentioned converge or overlap a lot with conceptions or ideas about what the rule of law is about. The question of how do you actually implement rule of law, and I would say that first of all, the question there is to understand what rule of law is about, right? So, and to have a societal consensus about what the definition is, what does it consist of. And once you have that, then it's easier to understand and then to adopt policies that aim to implement that consensus. But for instance, such an element when it comes to the rule of law is how do individuals relate to one another, right? And on what basis do you create a more accessible society, right? In a society where individuals have ways to recognize each other's rights, but also to recognize each other's duties as well, right? Another way to think about the rule of law and then to understand what policies could be adopted as a result is to see and investigate a little bit further about how should individuals relate to the state and how should the state relate internally to. So how do different state agencies, for instance, have to relate to one another? So these are these other two dimensions of the rule of law that I mentioned about earlier. Another dimension of rule of law that is often discussed about is what sort of socioeconomic rights citizens, individuals have, and this is very much connected with economic development, right? Because often development is not simply thought as an economic or in economic terms, it's often thought also these days as a social phenomenon. And that is why when we think about development, we tend to frame it as a socioeconomic transformation. And in that sense, when it comes to that conceptualization, when we think that, okay, development is about social rights, it's about economic rights, rule of law here plays a role because it's about how do you recognize those social and economic rights, right? So how do individuals recognize those rights between one another? How does the state enforces those rights? But also, how does the rest of the society think and treat those rights, right? So, for instance, a particular powerful agent of development are corporations, right? So the private actors, and in that context, the question is how do corporations deal with economic rights, with social rights, like civil rights as well.